Welcome to Intangibles podcast. I'm Steve Berg, your host. Success is driven by how as much as by what. How we communicate, how we lead, how we relate to our environment are all vitally important. Intangibles is a podcast that explores the underlying traits, qualities, and behaviors that improve the how. This is accomplished by finding the people who have studied and been successful practicing these soft skills and having informed conversations with them to get to what is learnable. Let's begin. In the subculture where the pickpocket resides, you will hear lingo like whiz mob, which include members nicknamed the steer, the stick, and the mechanic, who participate in skinning the pole from Mr. Bates. It's all very slick. And then there is a sheer coolness in the notion of being a little bit bad. Not to mention the adrenaline of committing a petty crime. But that's the veneer. The even more interesting part is the mental game the pickpocket plays. There are a set of skills the very best pickpockets possess that are highly relevant to how we interact with people, given the intent of creating a positive outcome for ourselves. I was turned on to Apollo Robbins via a 2013 article in The New Yorker by Adam Green called A Pickpocket's Tale. It sent my brain to Pluto. Then I started to do research, and when I saw him steal the eyeglasses off of someone's face, all I could do was shake my head. A couple of interesting facts about Apollo. He began pickpocketing in junior high school with some initial training from his older brothers. He once set his head on fire in a not too bizarre fire-eating accident. By my calculations, he picked approximately 81,000 pockets between 1998 and 2002, and he gave everything back. He is friends with names like High Pocket and Finger Wave Dave. He was diagnosed with off-the-charts ADHD at an older age, but considers it an asset for his chosen profession. He was born with gross motor skill deficits, so much so that when he first started drawing as a child, he had to hold the pen with both hands. Knowing this, you probably would not put Apollo on your destined for success list, would you? But once you hear him talk, you will understand. Welcome, Apollo, to Intangibles podcast. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to join you.
Before we begin, I didn't say anything about Ludus Labs in the intro. Maybe you'd like to say a word or two.
Ludus Labs is a collective consulting agency that I have right now. It's a partner with my wife, whose background is in psychology. And we like to explore the space between fact and fiction, which means deception, games, pretense, but that tends to be quite, not just deception, but also self-deception.
Yeah. And I'm going to give a teaser to people. Apollo was kind enough to send me the teaser of the next thing I assume Ludus is working on, right? Mm-hmm. And it's amazing. So you guys are going to have to look out for that. So as I mentioned in the intro, the act of pickpocketing, it's fascinating to most people. It's really interesting to watch. It's kind of humorous. And there's a lot of physical techniques that you use. However, there's two reasons that we're not going to be talking about those specific techniques today, right? One of them is, first, because they're not completely relevant to the podcast. And the other is that there's a visual component, which unfortunately we don't have, the listener doesn't have, right? So what I'm going to do is before people that might be listening just like tune out, why don't you direct them to the best content, the YouTube, whatever it is, that they can go, pause this, go check it out, be completely amazed and be like, oh, I got to hear what this guy got to say.
Okay. I did a TED Talk that's pretty popular. It's called The Art of Misdirection. Try not to read the comments before you watch it because there are some spoilers in it. It's about 10 minutes long, but it kind of gives you the balance between the visual eye candy and also a little bit of the cerebral mind play.
Yeah, I love that one as well.
The other one is on the Today Show. Somebody else posted this, but it was an appearance I did on there. It's called I think they call it the Supernatural Pickpocket if you look it up on YouTube. What's unusual about it is that normally I don't show the full speed pickpocketing that I do. I only do it partially because I don't want people to have a reference. So in that one, you can see me sometimes steal at full speed. And then there's a TV series I worked on for a long time with National Geographic called Brain Games. And that has, so through the first 2 seasons, I was a producer on that show as well. So you get to see the space outside of that. And then the last one, if you care to go in a deep dive, Boston Museum of Science, I did an interview with John Gabrielli, and that walks through a lot of intersections of the discussions of biases and heuristics and how they come into play.
So I'm going to I loved the TV show, and there's actually a couple techniques which I think I found incredibly applicable. So I'm going to be touching on those. You probably already know this later on. All right. So first of all, I never do this, but stop listening to the podcast, go watch those. And when you come back, I'm sure that Apollo will have your full attention. All right, so pause. Okay. All right. So look, glad to have you back. Let's get into it right away. For those that didn't actually go check out your video, why don't you set the stage? My son, when he heard that I was talking to you, he was really excited because he thought, I'm going to learn how to get things. But that's not really your particular interest. It's clear, right? You don't keep what you take, you give it back. It seems to me your interest is the control of fluid environments, right? So
That's a nice way to say it.
If you could start us out by explaining kind of what you do at a high level. I was thinking maybe the Jimmy Carter story, Secret Service story, which I think is a great one. Or I love the first time that you met Penn Jillette and how that interaction, like just something to kind of set the table for us.
It's fun sometimes crafting stories for other people to tell about you. That's kind of where you tell whether a story is. I think a lot of the things that have been said about me tend to get exaggerated online. So one of them that really changed my career that was important to me was the Jimmy Carter story. And specifically why I was coming backstage to work one time when I was working at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. And my boss had said, there's a president coming in who was Jimmy Carter. He's got a Secret Service detail with him. And there are some new rules they've done background checks on everyone. And he singled me out of the whole team that was performing that night and said, Apollo, they're not going to let you shake his hand because they're afraid it would get in the news if you were to pickpocket from Carter. Everybody laughed. And then as they left, he pulled me to the side. He said, but they didn't say anything about the Secret Service. So if you'd like to give that a shot, you're welcome to. So he pulled me out of my role in the show that night, and the Secret Service was stationed in details of 2 officers per location or entry. And I moved around and started walking up to meet them. And it was an interesting experience for me. I got pulled aside by Caesar Security beforehand, and they said, we're not going to take liability if you do certain things. So here's a couple of advance warnings. Don't take their weapons because it's never considered entertainment. It'll still be a felony. If they take you to the ground, understand that we're not going to have any liability associated to it. So I approached 2 of the officers that were, 2 of the agents that were by a door. And when I approached them, I noticed that they moved differently. I think they refer to it as how they manage occupied space. They turned their body to make sure that their weapons weren't accessible, and they knew who I was. I used the situation of some of the psychology, which we can talk about in a little bit, to bypass that. And I ended up taking the credentials and the itinerary and the keys to the motorcade during that interaction. And they didn't have the keys, but an agent later on had the keys. But I ended up stealing from several of them. And it changed my career, not because of the incident of stealing from people, which I had done a lot, but instead because that I was asked to speak to the Secret Service. Then some neuroscientists heard about it and said, do you have some theories about why you were able to do that? And I did have some theories. They said, well, can we actually test that in a lab? Can we use eye tracking software? And we could, and we did. And that got published in Nature Journal Scientific Magazine. And that changed my career about 15 years ago.
Yeah. So, I mean, perceptive in that the next question literally is like, okay, so you have military paying attention to the things that you do. You have behavioral psychologists and neuroscientists. And the reason they set out to interact with you is because that you've become kind of expert, especially proficient in certain areas. You started to highlight some of those areas. What do you think? Well, you know the answer to the question. What is it that they are particularly interested in concentrating on? I
think the domains that you just mentioned, the common element is the human interaction. How well can we, there's traditionally magic focuses on perceptual illusions. What I tend to do actually takes advantage of cognitive illusions because so much of the expectations or priorities that we have affect what we're looking for. And since the style that I'm rather known for is that I can tell someone that I'm going to steal from them and then still do it, that requires me to manage the narrative that they're telling themselves. So I really dance in that space a lot, and that becomes applicable to marketing, applicable to decision making, and in that space, whether it's military deception, they have to question the way that they think about an ever-changing environment with technology that becomes disruptive industries and enterprise. So I play in a lot of those spaces, mostly with how to manage the stories that the audience is going to tell themselves.
Right. So, I mean, and frankly, that's the good way, right? It's one thing if I tell you, hey, this is the way it is. It's another thing if you come to the conclusion that this is how it is without fully understanding that your environment has been manipulated for you to get there on your own, right? That's significantly more powerful.
It is. And there's a really simple definition of deception by a strategist named Barton Whaley. He says that deception is the intent to distort someone's perception of reality. And I think that's interesting because it doesn't have any ethical or moral slant on it, but it's really what I'm doing. I'm distorting their reality by managing the narrative. And that doesn't always require me to deceive them. I can put, to cover something or hide something, I can put a series of facts in a certain order that makes sense to them that they arrive at a wrong conclusion.
Mm-hmm. So as I was thinking through what I've learned about you thus far, I broke that down into a couple of broad categories, right? Observation, perception, attention, certainly an element of choreography, behavioral psychology, as we talked about, and then, of course, technique. And so what I'd like to do, if you're up for it, is ask you a question or two about each of those kind of high-level categories and see what we can kind of ferret out, about how you make that all make sense.
Sure.
Okay, great.
I might, as the ADD calls out, I might start to loop through some of those and show how they connect as we go through the phases.
Fantastic. That's actually great. I'm particularly fascinated by that as a strength, by ADHD as a strength relative to a weakness. And other people have said it as well. David Boies has said, yeah, there's no way I would be where I am today if I didn't have that to push against, to fight against, to improve myself against. And, well, we'll get into what you've said about it going forward here. All right, so observation. One point that I've seen you make is that people observe a very small part of the world and then they mentally fill in the rest, right? Talk about like either what you mean or why that is. Like explain why I am, filling in the backgrounds of things necessarily.
We have the illusion that we see more than we do, but really there's a funnel into the skull bone that is our brain. And that funnel is the senses. And it's all this data that's collected from our environment. And a poetic way, the Thoreau quote is not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. The difference between look and see is huge because you're collecting information that now you're editing to say, is this relevant? Is it not relevant? Is it relevant? And a lot of that happens automatically. That editing process is really interesting because it comes from your background of experiences of what you think is important. So much of our observation can be limited by our curiosity, how we ask questions about our environment. What are the things that pique your curiosity? If we think we have the answers, it tends to cut down on that curiosity so that we tend to just remain on autopilot and we observe the same things over and over again. And that can actually lead to psychological blindness.
So is it enough to know that that is a potential weakness or, it is a way of combating that, kind of internal limitation? Or are there other things, there's ways to become more observant? There's ways to understand the right things to focus on, right? I've been learning to play the guitar lately, right? And I'm constantly moving between the strings that I'm strumming and the position of my fingers and the chords, right? And as I watch other guitar players, they always have their eyes in the right place, right? They're already looking at the thing they need to be looking at before they make the adjustment, right? So in this instance, I'm asking you, like, is there a way to know where to place your eyes? And I mean that metaphorically, so that you can be more observant.
So moving from metaphor to balance between metaphor and relevance. I don't know if this makes it more clear, but if you think of how we collect information, that's what observation really is, right? It really keys on two things: our senses and our attention. And our attention sometimes drives our senses, what we turn to look at. So, to the point of what you just said with the guitar, it starts to become very important of where you're going to dedicate your resources. And it's important to know that attention is a limited resource. So then you now have an attention economy, which means if I have $100 mental, where am I spending them? Now, the thing that you look for is not just so much where you look for, but also when. For example, when you think of critical thinking, we ask people to, if we just have more critical thinking in society, it's not, that's an attention drained resource that requires our attention. So we really need to question when and where. So it becomes the economical use of our attention can increase our observation. Our senses are limited. We can subsidize them with technology to be able to rewind and watch things again, which is functionally what we do. But really, the ability to know when do we need to actively question the things that we thought we knew. Since things are changing so fast and truth often expires, it's important for us to be able to question the things that we thought we knew.
Yeah. And your mind, I mean, just the follow up on that is that your mind gets into a groove where it thinks, I don't need to be questioning. Right. This is a kind of a mental safe space, but sometimes it turns out it's not. Right. So
Yep. Okay. It's easy for us to go on autopilot. We see something that looks like this. Oh, that's just like this. An easier question to ask yourself, maybe specifically, is why is this not like what I think it is? And that's a backwards way to look at it. It's like, and that's really, if you want to use that for somebody deceiving you or magic, sure, it looks like this. Why is it not? But now it becomes, when are you going to dedicate that kind of focus to it?
Got it. All right. So I'm going to move to perception. So saying someone has a criminal mind, that has a negative connotation. But frankly, in my mind, that's essentially just a way of thinking about how one perceives the world. And I think you call it grift sense. And if I'm not mistaken, you believe it's one of the actually more important senses. So can you give a little context about grift sense?
From a thief's perspective, it's used in a lot of different places. Some examples: a card sheet. Working at a table might be palming out a card out of the deck. And as the deck goes around, he needs to be able to sense when somebody becomes suspicious so that he's able to put the card back in the deck before they call for the deck to be counted. That sense is almost like a feedback loop, like a spider web, knowing that someone has raised their suspicion. It's a skill that I think overlaps into social empathy, that it's really important, our ability to read other people and know where they are in a situation and to be able to predict. And now in social psychology, they have a lot of terms for this. Empathetic accuracy. Malcolm Gladwell recently had a book about this. I think Talking to Others is what's called. Nicholas Epley, I believe, had a book called Mindwise. So there's a lot of space in this for a thief. Why it's so important. Imagine that I'm walking down the street and I need to steal from someone. I'm not going to talk to them because I don't want them to remember my face if I'm doing it on the street. So knowing what they're spending their time on and how sticky their attention is on that, if it's a phone call, are they arguing? I have to really know how sticky their attention is to that particular topic before I'm going to make an action or move on that.
Mm-hmm. So, would it be fair to say that you've increased your perceptiveness over time?
Yeah, in that space, I'm good at following a simple way you might think of it as following a train of thought. Inside of a situation with multiple people, I can have a pretty high accuracy of following trains of thought.
I see. Right. So, I mean, I guess the point that I'm trying to get you to make, which I think you did, is that people can become more perceptive, right? They can train to that.
Yeah, you see things that others don't. Now, that's an argument that I've had with, not everybody agrees with that you can increase perceptiveness. But you have to, are we defining perceptiveness as the things you notice? I think that we can increase the things that we notice. We can't increase our senses necessarily, but we can increase things we notice just by asking different questions about them. I see things that people don't inside of a crowd because I look for things that are different than most people. I question why things are the way they are. But but we all have a limited resource. That comes at a cost of not noticing other things.
Yeah, well, but I mean, the thing about it is if the underpinning of that is intellectual curiosity, certainly you can will yourself to be more intellectually curious by literally beginning to ask more questions.
Yep. And then that goes back to the when, because it is limited. When are you going to spend your bucks on that? And there's a great quote, Renee Magritte, that it's everything that we see hides something else. So it comes at a cost. When we focus on something, it's hiding something else from us.
Okay. All right. Attention. You've said that attention is like water, that it flows. I believe you've also said that what you do is actually like surfing people's attention. And to add one more facet, I think you've talked about framing people's attention, right? So that's back to the control piece. What does that mean in the context of not of you stealing something or learning to steal something, but of in the context of you driving toward a positive outcome in anything, right? In a conversation, in a negotiation, in a debate, in a just a friendly social interaction.
So first, I guess one thing in looking at how it's manipulated, and some keywords I talk about managing or surfing it. One thing I don't say is controlling it. And that's probably the more interesting part that's relevant to a lot of areas. I don't believe that I can control someone's attention, but I can manage it and I can move with it. And that's a gift for us to be able to follow someone's attention. When you're doing something like the phenomenon, what people refer to as misdirection, there's three simple kind of ways you can think about it. One is that I get you to spend all your mental budget on one focal point, and that's the only thing you know exists. It's the only channel that's on TV. Or two, you can spend it in lots of little places, but you only spend small amounts, so there's no real value to you. You get overwhelmed. That's typically what we think of when we're looking online and we get overwhelmed with technology. Or I can change the moment. You think it's going to happen, then I could do it at a different time of that. So in managing the attention for day to day, one of the things that often will happen with all of these is the frame of what do I put the situation? When does it apparently begin and when does it end? How well can we question the frame? Whether that's something that we're presented with, a choice that we're being given, how well can you question that frame and look outside of it?
So in that answer, I'm guessing you think that moving someone's focal point is different than directing their attention. Because I know I've absolutely seen you move someone's focus point.
You can move it implicitly or explicitly. Explicitly, if I move it, it may not be as sticky. If I do something to make their body turn, if they do it themselves, if they make the choice, they think it's their choice to look in a certain place. And there's ways that you can do that just through combinations of motions. But most of it's narrative. If they believe that it's important for them to look. So how well can I unlock that priority?
Right. And I think, in my mind, this is a perfect segue into the next piece, which is choreography, right? And kind of what that implies. And this goes back to, again, my initial impression of you in control. When I watch you work, you're always kind of moving people around. Not that I would be doing that physically, but there are aspects of that seem important. The aspects to choreography that seem important. So I would think one of those things is essentially pre-planning, or if not pre-planning, the recognition of a normal pattern of interaction, right?
And since we're saying choreography kind of relates to a music metaphor, you can think of sheet music and jazz. So between that, being able to plan, but also adapt. Sometimes people stick too hard to their plan when the reality shifts. So in that, when I'm choreographing, my style is less like a dance, but more like sparring in a martial art, and that's directly responsive to someone else. And I study martial arts. I've studied a lot of my moves come from half circles and certain motions that draw people's attention in Aikido and things like that. But it really becomes something in a social interaction that I think is very useful to us if somebody's talking too closely to you and they're very much inside your space. Just being able to turn and look sideways, shoulder to shoulder with them as you share a common view can help validate them, but still keep them close and give you space too.
Well, I mean, to me, the other thing associated with that is, and this gets back to moving someone's eyes, again, metaphorically,
Mhm.
you have the opportunity to obscure the senses,
Mhm.
right? I don't know if Frank is later on in my Q&A, but Frank is your little in your brain operator, right?
Yeah.
And so in the choreography, if you put them in the right position, then you have the better opportunity to, again, obscure.
Yeah.
There's a context to that that's negative, and I don't want to imply it.
A simple way is blind spots.
Right.
Yes, just by positioning someone, there's blind spots. But where we start to move is away from observation of, yes, I can block somebody from seeing something just with the movement that I do, so their sight line's blocked. But now you're mentioning Frank, I'll kind of tiptoe into what that is. During my TED Talk, I talk about this idea that for me, a simple way of thinking of it is that there's a little security guard in your mind. He's taking in all these camera feeds and audio, and he's looking at his screen, but sometimes I can't stop him from seeing something, but I can make him turn around at his desk and look something up. So by asking him a question, so if I'm pickpocketing someone, I might say, "That American Express you had in your wallet." And just by saying "had" is a past tense phrase that makes them now rewind the tape for the last couple minutes of our interaction, thinking, "What did he just do?" And when they do that, that mental rewind, they can't, even though their eyes are open, they're not seeing. They're looking, but they're not seeing. And that's a key difference. And so even though we have the eyes open, we're looking in the right direction, I can stop them from seeing some things.
Well, so you're defining just literally the act of mental recall will give you a
Mhm.
half second there where
Yes.
you can change things.
And there's multiple things that do that.
Right.
So the recall, they're like shadows. They're shadows in an observation. Someone's going to tell the story of what they see, and the things they leave out are the shadows. And I'm able to play in multiple beats like that.
And so, one of the things that occurs to me is you have to be pretty comfortable with what the baseline is. And what I mean by that is, what does the normal interaction look like? If I do this, they're going to do that. How does what are the 3 or 4 or 5 pieces in a row on the chessboard that are going to move? And,
Mhm.
in my estimation, the only way that you really can establish a baseline is probably the same way you get to Carnegie Hall, right? Practice, practice, practice.
Yeah, but not practice solo. You got to be doing it with real fresh eyes. That's the unusual part. So I'm rusty in some ways compared to where I used to do, because I used to have so many reps in the work that I did, and uh, it's a big difference, because if I practice just some technique just by myself, that allows me to put that technique on autopilot so I don't think about it. But the ability to manage or influence someone to do a certain thing inside of a situation really requires a lot of social interaction.
Absolutely. And by the way, the other thing I would say about that I've noticed is it's gotta all seem natural, right? Because that goes
Mhm.
back to the perceptiveness, right? On the other side, they're like, "Hey, wait a minute, what's going on here?" And you don't want their spidey senses to get tingling either, right? So,
Yeah.
but then that leads to all right. So now you've got your baseline per se, but this is where you're talking about the ability to improvise, right? To
Mhm.
understand, okay, something has differentiated, a standard deviation from the norm, and that is going to require a slightly different approach, right? So,
And
yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
a way of thinking about that is, if you think of this as a big loop. So you collect something, the information, now you're processing it. I don't know what's happening inside your head of how you're processing it, except that I can look at what you're focusing on and I can see what your response to that is. So I can kind of deduce or infer what you're thinking about. But inside that, if you see something that raises your attention and it's anomalous or it's a surprise, there's certain things that you're going to do. You're either going to ignore it, you're going to shift between different theories. Is it this, or this? You're going to use past experiences to pull into it. You're going to make an exception to it. A lot of these are very aligned with something we'll talk about probably later in research, but the cognitive psychologist Gary Klein has what he calls a data frame model. And it's very much the same type of thing. It's inside of that, I'm playing with the suspicion level of what you choose to do with it. And whether that's rationalizing the story, how well can I sense the hypothesis that you're going to try to generate? If you say it to me, I can now manipulate your hypothesis and feed it or suppress it, depending on what I want to do.
Yeah. So what you just did there is you provided the right way to improvise, because once you start improvising, it can completely go off the rails. But you just gave us the 3 or 4, different things to do that are the right things, so that it doesn't go off the rails, so that you can keep it tight, or you can bring it back to baseline, which is, if you were listening, hopefully that was helpful.
And one more simple thing on that. I tend to think, yes, I have past experience influencing what I'm going to do. So A, B, or C, but I also think of D. What if it's none of the above? And that's now jumping off the cliff and building the plane on the way down. That's where you have to trust yourself. Some might call that the flow state. But that ability to, yes, these things have worked in the past. This person doesn't work like that, or this moment doesn't work like that. So let's build this together.
Right. And a willingness to crash in the event that you don't on the way down.
Yes.
It's going to happen. All right. Let's see. Behavioral psychology. So you've mentioned it a couple of times. I am privileged in that one of the podcasts that's going to come out in the future is a woman by the name of Dr. Diane Halprin. And she was the president of the American Psychological Association, and she wrote an amazing actually text on critical thinking. And I'm sure, I actually fear that conversation in that it could be 3 hours long. It's just, there's just so much to talk about. But, having you in front of me, we can take a little bite-sized chunk of that. So, one of the things we'll talk about is biases and heuristics. And, those things, well known, can be manipulated. Talk just a couple about some of the biases and or heuristics that you focus on, that you feel like you can take advantage of in manipulating the world around you.
I'm going to give you the answer that you want there, telling you those, and then my question, the frame of the question.
Oh, okay.
Just in case an example.
Or you can just do the first one first.
Yeah.
I'm good. Okay.
So the theory of heuristics and biases, and that lane of Kahneman's thinking, another lane of thinking about that is as this phenomenon of naturalistic decision making, which is Klein's. There's a great paper on this between Kahneman and Klein about professional intuition. And I, for a long time, looked at heuristic and biases and tried to label them, of saying, what am I doing here? Am I using a lot of confirmation bias? I tend to do that a lot. I feed them the narrative that they want to see. I do a lot of sunken costs, and that I start to weight their decisions and add that to it. And I use time parameters and a lot of those pieces. But what these start to do is they start to make them an outlier, that people think, well, we shouldn't do these things, when the majority of the time they work well. But contextually, when we frame them in these ways, it is like this mental magic trick that in this context, it doesn't work. And I do a lot of things that exploit them. But the phenomenon, I think, of how we make errors in decision, I would promote that as a resource. Stepping back, you said about critical thinking. What if critical thinking is a myth? And that's something that we often think, yeah, we need more critical thinking, but are there good examples of critical thinking happening in mass, of us teaching it to a mass group of people? It requires us to have focus. So if we just talked about how it's a limited focus piece. So if we now have to couch, to me, the priority of when do we do critical thinking? How is the consideration of an alternate hypothesis not, where does that slide off the slip and turn into conspiracy theory, where they imagine an alternate hypothesis and it goes into la la land? So
I would say that, broadly agree, the one place where we differ in agreement is limited resources. So I fully believe that everyone has a limited ability to pay attention, to make rational decisions. But I also believe that if that is a reservoir, right, that one can increase their reservoir by practicing it and by finding the edge, going out to the edge and then coming back from the edge. So that I think that, certainly, if you look at a president of the United States, for example, over time, they can't have the same focus limit as I do for the amount of stuff that they have to do, right? So they have to keep practicing, and that over time, people with responsible things that have mental heavy lifting to do, I do believe that they increase their reservoir of capacity for mental focus, decision, and critical thinking. The final thing I would say on that.
I don't think it's a difference. I think this might be helpful to clarify. I think what it is what you're referring to sometimes what they refer to as chunking, where it's the efficiency of the use to process more information and to have support teams and other things that can hand that off, and which is very much needed in leadership. But the individual still, like for myself, people tend to think, oh, do you have more attention than most people do? I still have something that's coming across, but I process things faster and in certain ways faster than other people would. But just because I can process it more doesn't necessarily mean that I have more attention. It becomes a semantic issue, right? I still have a certain amount of minutes in a day and where am I attend my attention to, and that comes at the cost of something else.
Well, and then the other thing I would say is that one, we don't teach critical thinking in school typically, right? You don't get a book when you're in first grade like, hey, this is how you do it. The other thing that, but we should. But the other thing is the awareness, right? Just you talked about the heuristics that you like to play on. If I'm aware of that, then I can see that happening. I can say, oh, I can put an edge around that.
But unfortunately, that doesn't work. Knowing it doesn't help stop it, which is surprising because we think if we can put a label on it, and that's what the danger is of labeling the heuristics. I went into, I won't name names on this, but with a group of decision theorists and statisticians, and I sent the probability on a con game that called the Razzle Dazzle ahead of time. And I started to play the game with some of the students, and they started to get their hooks into it. And the professor that was there was saying, why you've read this number spread on this, you understand that he's using confirmation bias and sunken cost in this specific piece. Why are you not backing up? But I'm using all the human strings of the con, just so you have to decide, do you want this to be a marathon or a sprint? That you run the race. And all those strings that I'm pulling are the problems that in human behavior, our emotion comes into our reasoning and the time elements. And if I'm moderating that, it helps for us definitely to know and be familiar with them because we can flag these things, but we really have to know what the animal looks like in real life versus just intellectually knowing about it.
Okay. All right. So you mentioned Kahneman. Is it true that you once spent 45 minutes talking to Kahneman about inattentional blindness?
I think we talked about a number of things, but yes, I didn't know who he was at the time. It was before his book had come out. I think it was a thought leaders conference, and it was him and Tetlock were the two gentlemen I was sitting with at the table. It was a fascinating conversation, but I was debating with them about intentional blindness and if it could be covertly that I could covertly task someone instead of overtly task them. And I demonstrated on stage. So it was a fun conversation afterwards too.
So anybody who, first of all, wow. But second of all, go read about inattentional blindness. So speaking of reading, you are a big reader. And at the end, I'll always ask, what other texts are your favorite or no? And you've already mentioned 3 or 4 or 5 here. But you said that one of the books that you paid close attention to is Cialdini's Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion. Why would that be?
I think there are 2 versions of it when you go to buy it. There's the one that's just written for the general public, and then there's the annotated version with his studies. And to me, that was the hook and bait when I was early on, that I could look up the studies and reference them as well, see the sample groups. And for being a non-academic, it's an interesting place to add credibility to it. And I love the examples. They're very pragmatic. They highlight how there's a categorical relevance to the way animals will behave in certain situations, and we do the same thing. And it's been a really big highlight for me as far as an inspiration.
I think he's interested, like you are, in those little moments when the mind is led to a desired choice, right? When you've successfully led the horse to water and it begins to drink. Okay, so I said that we would talk about some techniques that I've seen you demonstrate, and I think this is a part of the National Geographic show. One of these things, and we started to talk about a behavioral psycho and biases, is there's mental shortcuts, and that is you know again, to talk about what we're talking about, you get Frank paying attention to something else, right? How do you do it?
Ideally, it's something Frank already wants to pay attention to, and in that way. To me, mental shortcuts often work like we think of heuristics. They help us, especially experts. The more that we become an expert at something, the more we put that part of us on autopilot. And We have to do that in order to become better at what we do. An athlete has automated so many different things that he's done. If I can know some of their little shortcuts that they're taking, I can take advantage of the gaps in between those, and I can work in those gaps.
We often get into behavioral patterns, right? And I think when we get to the point where we're expecting the next thing in that pattern to happen, and if you somehow interrupt that and it's not the thing that you expect, then there's that moment of, wait a minute, I've got to like wake myself up here and figure out what the heck's really going on. That I thought was interesting.
I use that a lot in surprise. That if I, one of the hardest things for me to steal is to take someone's glasses while they're wearing them, and it changes their vision. So it's a good example, I think, of what we just talked about, that their vision changes. But if I do it right, they don't remember the moment that I took them, and they don't realize their vision's changed. And I'll often use that where they're chasing me pretty aggressively. They've established some kind of pattern that they think they have an understanding for. They have a pretty good confidence level on it. Then I create some moment of surprise where they realize maybe we're on the wrong track. Something maybe like I said before, that so the American Express you had in your wallet, whatever it might be. When they go to play that and they flip back in their head, I take the glasses off their face. And that is a magical experience both for the audience but also for myself, that if I've done it right, they aren't aware of the sensation of the glasses being removed. And now I can talk to them, put the glasses on, and carry on conversation while I'm wearing their own glasses, and they won't realize it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So another technique is directing someone's thinking either to something or away from something else, right? How do you begin?
We tend to think of social deception as like lying or concealing information, but we often don't focus on this other space of equivocation. How well can you bridge to other topics? How well can you justify a narrative and switch it onto another topic without them being aware? I do a lot of that. I do a lot of this equivocation of narratives to move them to another point, often using the momentum of something that they feel impassioned about. It's kind of like an improv, the term yes and. I accept what they say, I add more information. People are easier to convince of something they already believe rather than changing them to a whole new story.
Right. And by the way, I think of that under the category of choreography that we talked about earlier, right?
Very much so. It's just mental choreography.
Yeah. Well, and I think how could I talk to a pickpocket and musician?
Not yet. Still learning to play guitar.
Not musician. Magician. There we go. Yeah. Thank you. Without talking about misdirection, right? That is the tool in the toolbox, right? Talk about that as pretend it's like at a layman level about misdirection in terms of changing the flow, changing the conversation, changing the attention.
So let's give you some categories. I mentioned earlier these 3 states of if it's like mental dollars, how do I get you to spend them? But those are generally all in the space of perceptual misdirection. So if I wanted to divert your attention or your senses, then if I need them to look in a certain place, then I need you to look at one thing. Or I overwhelm you with lots of inputs. And so now that moves into this other space, which is psychological misdirection. And in that one, it becomes really interesting because sometimes they can hide things in just what you're already looking for. It doesn't have to make you look away. You can be looking straight at it. And that's the big key. People tend to think misdirection is about making you look off at in the distance while I do something over here. But for my work, if I do that, it's like throwing a boomerang in the distance. I don't know when your attention is going to come back and hit me. So I need to keep you attached to a narrative. And often, if I can find something that you're really already interested in, I'll use that as my focal point.
Right. And by the way, you can do that both visually and you can do that mentally.
Both, yes.
Yeah. I mean, with your words, you can kind of send somebody off in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
This is a more specific one. You can manufacture overconfidence in a person, right? Where they're just convinced of a thing and then they're shocked and awed when that overconfidence is not justified. How is that manifest itself as a tool in your toolbox?
I think people are becoming more and more confused between competency and overconfidence.
Back to my son.
And well, the idea of like the Dunning-Kruger effect that we used to think of that as this very special thing, but now as a society, we tend to walk around thinking that we have an encyclopedia in our back pocket, and we confuse that knowledge for expertise. So for me, if someone already has a skill set in an area, maybe the thing that they think is true is no longer true. I can change and take advantage of those assumptions. Have you ever heard these 4 stages of competency? Unconscious incompetence. Have you heard that before?
No.
So if I'm trying to learn, to your example, like a guitar, if I'm trying to learn that, I might think that I could learn to play it next week for a wedding because I'm unconsciously incompetent. I don't realize how hard it is. But then we move into conscious competence. Conscious incompetence, which I realize, wow, this is a lot harder than I thought. I'm here, and it's really like up on a level of 10 to get to it. That's a hard place for some people to move. The next one is conscious competence. You can do it, but it requires all your attention. And then there's this unconscious competence, which people call mastery. This has been taught for a long time, these 4 stages. My take on this is that what people don't realize is that now that's a loop. It's not 4 stages, but it's a loop because our environment changes so much that it's very easy for, if something changes in your environment, for you to move from becoming a master to becoming unconsciously incompetent just because you didn't realize something has expired. And so I take advantage of that space to find the overconfidence.
And just as a fill in the blanks for people who just don't have the Dunning-Kruger effect at the tip of their tongues, that is, if you know only a little bit about something and then you see it really simplistically, it biases you to believe that the concept itself is actually easier to comprehend than it actually may be. So there you go.
I've heard a funny way to summarize it as it's the direct correlation between your level of competence and your lack of competence to your overconfidence.
Right. Which is why people get promoted up to their level of incompetence. All right, I'm gonna speed up, or I want to keep with 10 more minutes here. Keep on time. Control of the choices, right? That's just defining the option set in a way that's favorable to you, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can do it in 2 ways. I can either frame and bracket your decisions down to choices that mostly benefit me. Something that's counterintuitive is if there's something I don't want you to do, I'll put it on the options. I don't hide it from you. Most people would think that you would. The reason is because if you choose option B that I don't want you to choose, I can at least control the narrative of how we engage with it versus you arriving on your own and now you drive yourself. The other option would be, how well can I rationalize it? For example, if we shoot an arrow against a wall and then I paint the target afterwards, if we have loopholes and we don't know where we're going, how well can I craft the story after the action's already been taken? So you do an action, I adjust the narrative for that.
Right. One other way I've seen it done is you create a false choice, right? You say, which do you want, more government spending or lower taxes, right? And that's just a false dichotomy. You don't have to have one or the other.
So that bracketing of those choices down, if all of them belong to me, it doesn't really matter. I mean, that's a fascinating example with Putin and his anti-Kremlin movement. Not his anti-Kremlin movement, but when he was facing an anti-Kremlin movement, he started hijacking the narratives of the protesters on Twitter and just changing their position by 10, 15% rather than changing it a lot. So they believed they could join 1, 2, or 3 different groups to protest it, but they were now controlled by him in different ways, with just small changes in the narrative.
Yeah. You alluded to the next one about the time frame, right? And you can kind of play with the time frame with which things are perceived, with which things happen. All right, that one's harder for me, frankly, as a tool in the toolbox for the control of one's environment.
Mm-hmm. So in a sneaky side, what a simple way to think of that is, if you can't change the technique, you change the moment. There's an expectation it should happen here, but I do it at a different time. And that's a very effective tool just by shifting the timing. The another way to look at it, there's a poetic way of saying this by a magician named Tommy Wonder. He says that the dream gives us the highlights give us the shadows, and the shadows give us our methods. And what that means is there's a story that someone's going to say, there's things that they leave out. How well you can predict what they're going to say when they're in that moment. The little blind spots that they leave out are the times, the beats that you can hit. The things that they think are irrelevant. I'm walking, I take a step up with my right foot, I grabbed hold of the table with my left hand. You're not going to think those are important. So timing tends to be of what are these, if you're surprised by unexpected change, if you see a pattern and now you think that you've established a pattern, there's all these little moments that are timing-based blind spots.
Right. I always kind of think of it as like a head fake in basketball, right? Where you go up, you're going to shoot the ball. It's just a matter of when are you going to shoot the ball, right? And if, that guy jumps and then he's on his way down, then it's way easier to shoot the ball.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a feint can be one form of it, yeah.
Okay, yeah, good. So, and then the final one of the techniques that I spotted was manipulate the priorities, right? And that is again, that can be done verbally, right? By, making something seem that is the thing that they want when it's really the thing that you want.
Yeah, a simple way that we might say it would be treating the important as unimportant and the unimportant as important. So it needs both those sides. If I need to hide what's important to me often in this case, so that your priority is, otherwise you'll rebound to it. If it feels too important to you, you might not do it. If it feels too important to me. So a lot of times it'll feel less important. I'll cloak that and I'll try to drive, whether I'm pretending to be an advocate for you to help you make a decision or advisor. Again, this is inside of an entertainment aspect, or laying out a con. So I can drive your priorities often by giving you the illusion of control.
Right. In terms of negotiation, I often think about that is if something appears to be a priority to somebody, then you're going to extract a higher cost for it, right? In order to be able to give that, like, oh, you want this? Well, it's going to cost you, right? But if my perception is that it's not that big of a priority, then I will assign the cost I think it is, which may be significantly less than the value that you think you're getting.
Yes, but that can also come to tangibles.
Sure. Yes, of course.
What are the things that you have perceived value? They think this issue is important to you, so they put it onto the negotiation table. But maybe it's not important to you. So just the manufacture of an important value to an object that you put on the table now becomes very useful as a maneuver.
Yeah, absolutely. You've gained a currency to be able to sell, to give on, to whatever. All right. Look, so that's the part that I wanted to talk about, and I typically end my conversations with the same three questions as a signal that we're kind of at the end. First of those three questions is, we talked about actually a number of the books that you find interesting, but what books were helpful as you defined your thinking in your practice of the craft? I believe there was one from an old one from 1946, which you have to buy used out of Amazon or something like that.
There's quite a few. I mean, if people are interested in cons or that kind of space, there are some very interesting books. David Maurer's The Big Con. He was a linguist that studied the language of thieves and pickpockets, and that's hence the name whiz mob and a lot of the language that we use. That was an early onset for me to look at thieves through their language and where that came from. Relevant to your listeners, probably. Some more, I wrote down a couple of ones I've been reading currently. Hector McDonald has a book called Truth that I think is very interesting. Traditionally, in deception, there's M style and A style. Misleading deception that makes you confident of a certain thing, or A style, which is ambiguity increasing. It creates chaos. I think a lot of things in society now are this chaotic environment tend to be that we're being deceived often with true statements, but it's a series of true statements given to us in a context that we have to question, why do we have this and how did we get it and who wants us to have it? So this book is really good on that. It goes through a history of looking at truth from different sides and different perspectives, instead of just it being a binary of true and false.
That is actually a great one. And I would say that's part of this critical thinking. So maybe there's some shades of overlap. I don't know.
Yeah. And I just think that the problem with the word critical thinking is it has so much semantic ideas of what it is that now it tends to be a fix-a-flat that people stop there. But I think we have to break apart what we thought critical thinking was and be specific with what we're asking it to be and what we're asking it to fulfill. Another great book by Gary Klein, the cognitive psychologist mentioned earlier, Seeing What Others Don't. Key point for this goes back to the focus point. He's arguing that in order for there to be innovation, we have to look at the decrease of risk and the increase of insight. The problem is that most people focus on the decrease of risk, trying to avoid those concerns versus the increase of insight. And so that's a look at different examples of him trying to chase what does it mean to increase insight. And he does case examples that he explores in that book.
So I'm in a constant state of debate about everything from investments to skateboards with my partner. And every time he picks up a book, I'm like, oh, damn it, I've got to go read that book too, because he gets all these tools in it. And so I think I'm going on the offensive with seeing what others don't.
I don't know who said the quote, but they said, when we buy a book, we believe that we're buying the time to read it too. That's a true statement.
There is a stack definitely in my still to be read book, although I like to think I get through a decent amount. Okay. You know what I didn't do here, and I probably should have even asked this as my first of the three questions, like, is there something about this topic that is either quintessential about it that I just completely failed to ask, or something that you just find particularly interesting that you don't get asked enough about, that you'd like a little moment to kind of expound on?
It's an interesting place. I'm in a place that I'm known for something that I don't do a whole lot anymore. I'm known for being this thief that can steal something from anybody. But I think what potentially is more interesting and relevant to most people is, what are the skills underneath that allowed me to do it? And how do they apply to other areas? And I think in this conversation, that's kind of what we started to tap dance to. And it's what I'm interested in now. Ludus Labs, the company that we founded, we try to expand out of deception into what's the space between fact and fiction, and what does that mean, all these different things of little truths, pretense, and we're really interested in exploring those. So I would hope that people would be curious in asking me about those questions outside of just how do we protect ourselves from getting pickpocketed.
Yes. I would hope that if people still came away from this thinking about this is a pickpocket interview, that they would be sorely disappointed that we actually did at least somewhat get to some of the things you're more interested in. All right. So you said, all right, I would hope people would ask me. That implies that you want people to find you. Where would you like people to find you?
Currently, the best place is my website, which is apollorobbins.com. If it's more intuitive or salient to you, then istealstuff.com takes you to the same place.
Yeah. And I would say, I'm guessing that we've got a relatively short amount of time until we have luduslabs.com.
Yes, Ludus Labs is coming up. It's not right there.
Not
but
there
we
yet.
also have some video training, some newsletters that are starting to come out through that. Just a whole platform with a team of social psychologists and other thinkers that we're all collectively working on.
And I mean, well, that kind of like, sometimes you go into a business's website and there's like products, right? Or about us. So, I mean, I assume that you're generating business, right?
Yep.
Commerce through this. So will you give some of the things that, types of project that you like to work on, or places where you can particularly unlock value or of particular interest to you? Will it be kind of laid out as if it's a consultancy?
It is. It will be both consultancy, and then we do live training. Currently, I do training both for law enforcement and for the DoD. I design a lot of interactive training, which is goes toward the space of what we think of with critical thinking, but it's situational to make them make decisions in uncertain environments. And now I'm looking at applying that to business and leadership, because now leadership has evolved away from the charismatic leader and more toward a situational leader. So how well can you take assessments of your environment, make decisions? So we're thinking about that a lot, of how do we design live immersive training that goes with that.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, hopefully, the people listening, that will help generate some business. Okay, Apollo. Look, let's end our talk here. You could probably tell I was really looking forward to this. I find the topic endlessly fascinating, and I think that the conversation has been filled with a lot of uncommon insight. And I just want to thank you.
Thank you. It's been flattering to dive deep into this space.
This has been Intangibles. You can find this podcast on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, and many other podcast platforms. You can also find it at its home on the web, which is www.intangiblespodcast.com. I'm Steve Berg. Thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode.